primary elections today, are voters confident? A slew of controversial Supreme Court decisions remain outstanding. Concerns are being raised over the cost of Michigan's RX Kids program. The Department of Justice investigating Philadelphia police over carry permits. And Louisiana sees fewer people on public assistance. This is the Center Square Daily for Tuesday, June 9th, 2026. I'm your host, Greg Bishop. Voters in 3 states heading to the polls today in South Carolina, North Dakota, and Maine. Of the 3, Maine has been taking a lot of the attention. Democrat and oyster farmer Graham Plattner continues to outpoll incumbent Republican U.S. Senator Susan Collins, despite mounting controversies about his treatment of women, fellow war veterans, and a now covered tattoo that resembled a Nazi symbol. Now, that race isn't until November. Plattner became the presumptive Democratic nominee for today's primary back in April after the governor, Janet Mills, dropped out of the race, citing lackluster fundraising. Another key statewide race is for Maine's governor. A slew of candidates are vying for the office after Democrat Janet Mills reached her term limit. Among Democrats, former Maine CDC Director Nirav Shah and former State Senator Troy Jackson lead in the polls. Shah has pushed for a moratorium on AI data centers in Maine throughout his campaign. Now, among Republicans, Bobby Charles has held a commanding lead in polls to secure the nomination and head to the general election. Charles has focused his campaign on reducing crime and taxes, including the state's income tax. Polls will be open in Maine until 8 p.m. local time today. For South Carolina voters, 5 challengers on Tuesday will try to unseat U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham in South Carolina's Republican primary. Recent polling from the Citadel casts Graham with a 10% lead over Mark Lynch. Other polls say the gap is wider. Staunchly conservative South Carolina Republicans will choose from 4 recognizable names and 1 political outsider in the gubernatorial primary Tuesday in the race to succeed Governor Henry McMaster. Now, polling has been tight for Lieutenant Governor Pamela Evette, State Attorney General Alan Wilson, U.S. Representatives Nancy Mace and Ralph Norman, and outsider Ram Reddy, former Exxon chemical manager turning around multiple companies through acquisition, restructuring, and sales. Now, last week's decision by the President of the United States, however, may have changed the trajectory of that race, but with those elections set to wrap up later tonight, there are still questions about races happening on the other side of the country. California's elections from last week. As we talked about yesterday, election results for Los Angeles mayor candidate Spencer Pratt became uncertain Sunday evening after City Council member Nithya Raman edged past Pratt. Mayor Karen Bass remained securely in first place with 34% of the vote in the June 2nd primary again a week ago, according to results shortly before 5 p.m. Sunday from the Los Angeles County Registrar's office. What does this do to voter integrity? Joining us to discuss the ongoing questions about election integrity and as we continue through primary season is former Maricopa County recorder and elections expert Stephen Richer. Stephen, thanks for taking time with us here for the Center Square Daily. Pretty remarkable what we saw happen over the weekend in California after people thought, hey, we're going to have somewhat of a balanced race going into November. What are some of the things as an election expert you're seeing out of California that maybe lessons for other states to do or not do?
Well, happy Election Day to those who are, in fact, voting today. And of course, happy ongoing Election Day for those who are still tabulating votes in California. And yes, of course, we're still talking about that. Now, this is nothing new. This is how it happened in California in 2024 and in 2022 and in 2020. That being said, it still strikes a lot of Americans as something that shouldn't happen. And so they look at other states in the country and they say, well, I know the winners of those contests on election night, but I don't know that for California, what's going on here. And that's, of course, perfectly acceptable to have questions about the process. But then when you dig into California, you learn what their public policy is, you learn what their state laws are, and you understand why it takes so long, even if you don't like it. And I think it's important to parse those out dissatisfaction with the public policy and how California conducts its elections, and fraud or mass error in the system. We've seen a lot of distaste for the first. We have not seen evidence for the second yet.
So, with California as an example, what is it that you think is leading to people being critical? I mean, even the president of the United States, without showing evidence, simply says, I could just look at it and tell that there's some fraud going on. Is there a way to shore up that integrity in our elections?
Yeah. So certainly the president of the United States is no stranger to criticism of the elections process. That being said, I do think that this instance extends well beyond people in the president's orbit to ordinary Americans who maybe don't think about politics that much. And so I do think that California should reconsider its election laws, such as its universal mail balloting system, such as whether mail ballots can arrive 7 days after Election Day if they're postmarked on Election Day, or they should allocate simply more resources to the process such that they can throw more workers in more space and be able to handle that glut of mail ballots that comes on Election Day faster, because researchers have shown consistently that if there is an unexpected, or unexpected to the voter at least, delay in announcing the winners, that does damage confidence. Now, there's a whole lot of other research that's going on as far as what improves confidence, but the number one thing that election officials can be doing is just be talking about it so that we can set expectations so that voters can understand what's happening at all steps of the process.
And when we were reviewing some of this yesterday, we noted that the president had an executive order dealing with elections, trying to bring some
Right.
uniformity across the board for federal elections. That's been held up in the courts. But if you can talk about the importance of the difference between elections, federal and state, right? I mean, you got members of Congress, that's federal, but state elections and local elections a little bit different. Is there concern of a bifurcation of if the president's executive order, or if Congress passes some kind of uniformity law, does that bifurcation make things a little bit more difficult?
That's right. So again, the president has long shown himself interested in election administration in the United States, and he has signed two executive orders since retaking the White House, one in 2025, one in 2026. It is exactly as you said. Those are held up in the courts right now. They've been enjoined, and largely because Article 1, Section 4 of the United States Constitution gives primary election responsibility to the states, with oversight and regulatory authority and sort of that standard setting, as you called it, to the Congress. Now, that has some pros. The federalist system, where states have their own laws and their own ways of doing things, it has some benefits. It's good for security in that if you wanted to corrupt the system, you'd have to corrupt 50 different states rather than just one federalized election system. It also allows states to experiment, and some states might see things that work well, and then other states might try them. But it has some downsides. And the downsides are that in our increasingly federalized politics and our federalized news system, a lot of people again say, well, Georgia knew their results on election night, California didn't. Or Georgia doesn't allow mail ballots to come in after election day, California does. What's going on here? That's damaging my confidence.
We're talking with former Maricopa County recorder Stephen Richer. He's also an elections expert about all of the different types of things that are happening across the country on primary election day, even a week after LA voters went and voted, and we still don't truly know the outcome there. Also, the governor's race in California, there was a big switch with the top three in that race as mail-in ballots came in. And Stephen, we reviewed a little bit of the different states and the different time frames they have. It seemed to be everything from 100 and some odd hours after an election all the way up to 2 weeks after an election for when mail-in ballots can be counted. Is this a new phenomenon, or is it something that's kind of a holdover from when mail-in ballots were considered absentee ballots?
Yeah. It's not a new phenomenon in the sense of how we process mail ballots and how we handle mail ballots in these various states. What is a relatively new phenomenon is just the popularity of mail voting has exploded since 2020, and that's especially true in the Western United States. So Washington, Oregon, California, Utah, Colorado, Hawaii, they all send mail ballots to every single one of their registered voters. And as a result, a high percentage of those people in those states return their mail ballot. They vote by mail ballot. Now, that's okay, but mail ballots have processes that take longer than if you show up to vote in person and you show your ID to somebody and then you feed the ballot into the tabulation machine at the voting location. Then all the election worker has to do is take out that memory drive at the end of the night and load it into the main database to aggregate the results. For a mail ballot, the election workers have to scan in the envelope to make sure you haven't already sent back a mail ballot or voted in person. They have to take a look at your signature on the ballot envelope to make sure that it matches the signatures in your voter record. They have to take out the ballot. They have to look at it with a bipartisan team, make sure it's not damaged, and then they feed it into the tabulation system. And so that's why you see on election night, Utah will have 65 to 70% of its results. Oregon will have around 60% of its results. Ditto Washington. And then California, the biggest but also the slowest of all these all-mail states, will have 55%. And then the next day they'll have 65%. And so while this wasn't unexpected, unfortunately, I don't think California got ahead of the conversation sufficiently. And I think they need to start doing that now to have everyone understand what they can expect in November, when California could suddenly be very, very significant for determining who controls the United States House of Representatives.
And finally here, Stephen, just some advice, I guess, for voters and elections officials across the country. What should they be watching for during primary season and in the rush up to November 3rd?
Be on top of your own information. Check your voter registration information before Election Day. Don't just show up on Election Day, hope all is well. If you vote by mail ballot, track your mail ballot. That builds confidence, but it also lets you have insight into the process. And then lastly, I've got to say this because I'm a former election worker. Please consider signing up to be a temporary election worker. It gives you great insight into the system, and it's also very helpful to your community and your chief election officials, who are always looking for thousands of people to be part of this process. And it's a great way to celebrate this important anniversary of American independence. And so hopefully a little plug in there for civic pride.
Greatly appreciate your time. Former Maricopa County Recorder and elections expert Stephen Richer here with the Center Square Daily. We'll be right back. The U.S. Supreme Court slapping down a decision from the Biden administration that regulated efficiency standards for furnaces and water heaters. The Center Square reporter Andrew Rice reports some justices on the High Court vacated the District of Columbia's court decision in American Gas Association versus the Department of Energy Monday, where the lower court upheld the Biden administration's decision to enforce regulations on non-condensing appliances. Now, lawyers for the American Gas Association and other trade organizations argued the Biden administration's rules improperly regulated the sale of commercial water heaters and furnaces, many of which you may have in your basement. The lawyers argued certain furnaces and water heaters would effectively be eliminated from the market. Now, court observers looking at that and other cases that have been released, They're also continuing to watch for other cases that are expected to be released over the next few weeks. And let's go through just some of those cases. You've got issues about immigration, and as we talked about in the previous segment for the Center Square Daily, mail-in ballots and how long those can be counted. Firearms laws are being challenged, and even the issue of transgender athletes. But let's go through these a bit here. For the birthright citizenship question, it's whether the 14th Amendment confers citizenship to all individuals born in the United States, regardless of the immigration status of their parents. Now, this comes after President Donald Trump, in his second non-consecutive term, signing an executive order trying to ban birthright citizenship in an effort that he says is just explaining the administration's position on what the definition of birthright citizenship means, seeming to throw it back to post-Civil War era times. Now, that case against the president's executive order was filed to the Supreme Court October of 2025. It was argued in front of the U.S. Supreme Court on April 1st. Now, it's not the only issue the Supreme Court's handling when it comes to immigration issues. For the asylum claims case, that's a question of whether an alien who is stopped on the Mexican side of the U.S.-Mexico border arrives in the United States within the meaning of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which provides that an alien who arrives in the U.S. may apply for asylum and must be inspected by an immigration officer. Another case involving immigration about temporary protective status. In this case, whether federal court judges can restrict the administration from implementing policies related to special immigration statuses. Now, whether a presidential administration can end TPS for immigrants from Syria and Haiti is at question, and we'll see what exactly happens with this particular case that was heard months ago and is now awaiting a decision. Another controversial decision the U.S. Supreme Court has yet to release, but could in the next few weeks, deals with what we've been focused on all throughout primary season, and that is mail-in balloting. And the question in front of the courts, and we'll see what they have to say, is whether states can allow mail-in ballots to be received after federal election day, if the ballot's postmarked by election day. Now, this case could send reverberations across the country in states that allow for mail-in ballots to be counted after Election Day. And as we've discussed in the past here with the Center Square Daily, states range from 166 hours after the election all the way up to 2 weeks after the election. Now, this case questioning the status of whether or not they can count those ballots, it was filed with the Supreme Court last June. The case was heard last month. Another big area that the U.S. Supreme Court is handling, even though they are sitting on some cases challenging firearms regulations, deals with the Second Amendment, and one in particular, firearms and drugs. And the question is whether individuals convicted of drug possession or drug use can possess a firearm under the Second Amendment. This case was filed with the U.S. Supreme Court in April of 25, and it was heard in March of this year. There's even another Second Amendment case that we're anxiously anticipating to be released by the U.S. Supreme Court, and we'll find out what their opinion is, concerning vampire guns. Now, this is whether states can place restrictions on individuals from possessing firearms on private property open to the public. This includes bars, beaches, and gas stations, and restaurants, and whether or not they can carry those without the owner's permission. Now, this was filed in April of 2025. It was argued in January of this year. And a case involving transgender athletes also remains outstanding. And the question is whether prohibitions on biological men competing in girls' and women's sports in Idaho and West Virginia violates Title IX. 2 cases, both were argued in January, and we'll see what the court says. But the court still has yet to decide whether they'll take a whole bunch of other cases, including cases impacting Second Amendment rights. And that's after the slew of different cases have been petitioned to the court, but they have yet to let us know whether or not they're going to take those cases. Now, the court's term ends in October, but case decisions are expected to drop throughout this month and next month. Be sure to get the newsletter at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back. Amid concerns of how limited tax dollars are being spent across the country on social service programs, more attention is being given to one in particular in Michigan that's giving hundreds of millions of dollars of unrestricted direct cash payments to pregnant women and children. Supporters and critics clashing over that. To talk about her latest story out of Michigan is Elise Apel with the Center Square. Elise, thanks for taking time with us. Obviously, people are interested in making sure that their tax dollars, whether it's the federal government going to the states that manage this and then the state dollars going to individuals, everybody wants to make sure those dollars are going to where they're needing to be sent. So give us the latest on what the debate is about the RX Kids program, what it is, and why people should care about this.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Greg. So this is yet another one of those taxpayer-funded programs, partially taxpayer-funded programs in this case, that people are just starting to ask, what is this money actually going to? What are we spending our taxpayer dollars on? So this RX Kids program is a program in Michigan that actually sends money directly to pregnant women, and then for up to 12 months after they've given birth, they also can get payments. So they send $1,000 to pregnant women, and then for each month after they give birth, depending on the community, up to 6 to 12 months, they get an additional $500. So this program has been describes itself as universal and unconditional. Very little guardrails. The application takes about 30 minutes to fill out. They themselves say it takes about 30 minutes, and they are, pride themselves on that. And then you just have access to money that is literally just directly deposited into your bank account, taxpayer-funded money. Some of it's coming from the state, some of it's coming from federal taxpayers through different programs. But this is a program that has been ongoing in the state since 2024. It was first passed there. It was implemented first in Flint, Michigan, but is now expanded to over 60 Michigan communities. So that could be counties, cities that have basically applied, and now residents within those communities can apply for this program. So this
when you say that anybody can apply, I mean, somebody has $1 million in savings in the bank, and they're the breadwinner of the house, brings in a six-figure salary easily every year. Are they qualified for this if they live in a certain community?
Yeah, so the problem is there are very little guardrails on this. The program administrators say that, you have to prove that you're on Medicaid, or there's some sort of, you have to show, there's somehow checking it against Medicaid, are you on Medicaid, which has some limitations to it. But the problem is, and this is what Republicans are pointing out, is that there are very little guardrails in this. They are concerned that, is this actually being checked? Are we actually checking these people's documentations? Because and I looked at it myself in reporting for the story, I looked at the application, and there was very little requirements that you actually have to send in to receive these payments just directly into your bank account.
Now, when it comes to the amounts that we've seen go out so far, are we talking tens of thousands? Are we talking, tens of millions or hundreds of millions?
We're talking hundreds of millions. So since 2024, they have received, just in taxpayer funding, $300 million. So we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars that are going out. They are very proud of the fact that they only have 15% in overhead costs, which is still a lot of money in overcosts for a program that's actually being administered by Michigan State University. So that's a really interesting aspect.
If I could just pause on that for a moment, because that's fascinating here, right? I mean, this is a taxpayer-funded program. It's being administered by a third party, by a university.
Yeah, so it's being administered. The founder and director is Dr. Mona Hanna, a professor at the Michigan State University. And so they're actually the ones that are kind of administering this program.
And they skim off the top 15% for administrative
So they
costs.
and that's been some of Republicans' concerns is that, okay, what are these administrative costs? Who are we sending these administrative costs to? Because they are taxpayer funding. Because another concern with this is, are illegal immigrants receiving this money? And this is something that Republicans have brought up. RX kids, their administrators, because they testified last week, they told Republicans that, oh no, we have different streams of funding, and none of the taxpayer funding is actually going to illegal immigrants. But Republicans, they're questioning, how do you actually know that? How do you know that, oh yes, this $300 million that we've received from taxpayers, none of that is going to illegal immigrants? There's no real way for them to, split the funding out in that way. Another example is, okay, say you get $300 million from taxpayers and you get $300 million from private funders, because this is a private-public partnership. They're, getting money from donors and other organizations. But if you're if you're spending that $300 million from private donors on illegal immigrants, and you're spending the other $300 million on the taxpayer funds on non-illegal immigrants, that's still, how are you really designating those funds to not go to illegal immigrants when they're taxpayer funding?
We're talking with Elise Apel. She is a reporter for the Center Square. Her latest story, supporters, critics clash over future of taxpayer funding for RX kids in Michigan. We're talking $300 million since 2024. Seemingly unrestricted direct cash payments, meaning they can use it however they want to use it if they apply and are found eligible. And for pregnant women and also children 6 to 12 months. I mean, this is a lot of money in a short span of time. Obviously, the proponents of this saying it's doing good. And I don't know if there's necessarily critics per se, other than just what I'm hearing from your reporting. They're just looking for some accountability to make sure that those tax dollars are being used properly. Are there any mechanisms in place for audits or an inspector general to do a review after a full year's worth, and then go back and try to ensure where those dollars are ultimately going, that they're being used properly?
So that's the problem. What does it even mean, for this money to be used properly when it's just going directly
unrestricted and
right?
Direct cash
it is unrestricted, and that's what some Republicans have brought up. These women could be using it to buy, because they receive $1,500 during pregnancy and then an additional $500 per month. They could be using it to buy alcohol. They could be using it to buy drugs. There's no real, knowing, because there's no real accountability on the other side of how are you actually spending this money. And that's been the real concern. And I was able to have an exclusive interview with the House Oversight Committee Chairman, Rep. Jay DeBoyer, who overheard a committee meeting last week where they actually talked about RX kids. And, really his questions were, okay, we need transparency, we need accountability for this program. But ultimately, he told me, is this the kind of program that our taxpayer funding should be going to at all? And ultimately, he thinks it shouldn't be.
I imagine there's already like women, infant, children programs, different types of taxpayer. 16 different programs. 16
different programs in the state of Michigan that Michigan residents could be, pulling money from in other ways. And I would imagine those also have more checks and balances, maybe, because you may be helping fund a particular service that's for healthcare coverage or for checkups, or the money's going to go towards formula or different types of nutrition things. Well, that was the other point that Rep. DeBoyer made, was when this, and he pointed out that he probably likely voted for this program because it was just thrown into a budget bill in 2024. And he actually pointed out what's really interesting about this program is with the name RX Kids. He said probably many people thought this was for pharmaceuticals. This was a prescription program.
Right.
And because I asked him a question, because there were a number of Republicans that actively supported this program when it was first implemented. And I was like, oh, well, why have you turned on this? Something that Republicans themselves were supporting. He pointed out, this is not the program that we thought it was going to be. And this is a first in the nation cash assistance program, but that administrators are really looking to expand both across the state but also nationwide.
Well, and if this is just 60 communities up to this point, and it's $300 million, you got to consider what that could possibly balloon into if it does go statewide, and what that means for the other programs. Is that going to offset the other substance programs like WIC or TANF or whatever other subsidy programs there are?
Yep.
Yeah, all of that is interesting to take into consideration. Elise, did they give you an indication finally here as to what the estimate was at first? Because I've seen these types of programs pop up in state houses across the country where the proposal's made, sounds good, questions about checks and balances, they give a real low ball number on what the estimated first year is going to be. But then when, all the chickens come home to roost, so to speak, it balloons up 100%, 200%. And all of a sudden they're holding a bill that some supporters may not have actually wanted to support. Is there an indication that happened with this particular program?
Yeah, definitely. And it seems like over time, especially as they're adding more communities, more cities or more counties are, joining this program, they are going to ultimately need more taxpayer funding. It is a private-public partnership, but they are in many ways, relying on this taxpayer funding, because if they don't receive it, they're going to have to fill that gap in some other way. And oftentimes, the taxpayer monies are considered they're kind of check the box of, oh, good, we received that grant and we're hoping to receive it, every year for the next foreseeable future. But that's really at question right now, with Republicans kind of shining a light on this in the House, and with Republicans controlling the House, are they actually going to be able to receive funding in the future? That'll be a real question.
Definitely people need to stay tuned to that, because it could be an indication of similar types of programs you may see pop up at your state house all across the country. Elise Apel with the Center Square. Check out her latest Supporters, Critics Clash Over Future of Taxpayer Funding for RX Kids in Michigan. Greatly appreciate your time. The U.S. Department of Justice announcing an investigation into whether Philadelphia police have good cause standards to revoke permits to legally carry firearms. Just today, in a letter to the mayor of Philadelphia, the DOJ said Civil Rights Division's Second Amendment section is conducting this investigation into whether the police department is violating the Second and 14th Amendments to the United States Constitution. In some statements made in the letter, the DOJ's Second Amendment Rights Division said that they will consider all relevant information, including pertaining to the efforts the city and the PPD have undertaken to ensure adherence to the Constitution and federal law. That's from Harmeet Dillon. She is the Assistant Attorney General. She continued in her letter that if we conclude there's reasonable cause to believe that such violations are occurring, we will aim to work cooperatively with the city and the police department to reach agreement regarding how to best remedy these violations, if they find those violations. Now, this isn't the first time that the DOJ has stepped in to announce either an investigation or, quite frankly, a lawsuit. You have this happening in various other jurisdictions across the country where there are questions about whether local or state governments are infringing on Second Amendment rights. But Dillon, in her letter to the Philadelphia mayor, said, if an appropriate remedy cannot be achieved through an agreement, the Attorney General for the Department of Justice is authorized to bring litigation in the United States District Court. Now, again, this is targeting Philadelphia and Philadelphia police. The issue of permitting carry permits and being able to revoke those permits. The mayor's office didn't immediately respond to an email seeking comments from the Center Square, but the DOJ said in their announcements of the investigation that it is a violation of the Second Amendment for government officials to use vague personal discretion when determining whether to issue or revoke permits to carry firearms. They went on further to say in 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court, in its landmark decision, Columbia versus Heller in the District of Columbia, that decision held that the Second Amendment protects the right of law-abiding citizens to possess weapons that are in common use for lawful purposes. Now, in 2022, the Supreme Court held in another case that permitting officials may not base licensing decisions merely on their personal discretion. The DOJ said in their announcements here, it is alleged Philadelphia police used just such discretionary standards to improperly limit Second Amendment rights. Now, to give a sense of where some in Pennsylvania stand on the issue of Second Amendment rights and the court's interpretation of that right to keep and bear arms, Pennsylvania State Senator Maria Collette, earlier this month on the Senate floor in Pennsylvania, gave a list of grievances about the current U.S. Supreme Court. She criticized rulings on election law, presidential immunity, and more, but she also took a moment to take aim at the landmark decision New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin from 4 years ago that set a new standard for how courts are to determine whether or not state and local governments can infringe upon Second Amendment rights of the people.
That same year, the question in Bruin was whether states could meaningfully regulate firearms in public spaces. To answer that question, the court relied on an interpretation of the Second Amendment that, until very recently, was rejected across the political spectrum. Chief Justice Warren Burger, a President Nixon appointee, a conservative, and the man who led the Supreme Court for 17 years, said publicly in 1991 that the rewriting of the Second Amendment as an unlimited individual right was, quote, one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, on the American public by special interest groups that I have seen in my lifetime, end quote. That was a Republican Chief Justice calling the entire jurisprudential project a fraud. And in Bruin, that fraud became the law of the land. The court invented a new historical test that has thrown gun safety laws across the country into chaos and tied the hands of legislatures trying to respond to mass shootings.
Now, this particular issue, far from resolved, even after the Bruin decision from 2022, which essentially said that governments have to show an analogy of their current law reflecting something from the nation's founding 250 years ago when the Second Amendment was included in the Bill of Rights. What does the Second Amendment say? A well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, whether or not this particular investigation into Philadelphia's police department's issuing of carry permits and being able to revoke those brings any fruit, we shall see. And the team from the Center Square will be continuing to track that story and the latest developments on these and other issues impacting your Second Amendment rights. We'll be right back. Now it's time for America's Talking, with headlines from across the country that you can find in the description below or in your inbox with the Center Square newsletter, free at thecentersquare.com. Let's talk about the Milwaukee Brewers. Center Square reporter John Stife reporting the Brewers are going to be adding a high-end private club and new first-row seats as part of a renovation fueled by $500 million in public funding agreed to by state legislators late 2023. The Trust Club, set to open in 2027. It'll be a 2-story open-air 20,000 square foot club that'll include everything from a valet option and priority departure, along with separate security and private lockers that go with 375 new seats. The wider seats, 23 to 24 inches, are going to be the first 6 rows between the dugouts. Now, the club will open on the concourse level of the stadium. But fans, even though some taxpayer footing is still covering the costs, they'll need to be full and half-season ticket members and will plan to pay prices that start at $245 for the seats. The all-inclusive seats include high-end food options and also in-seat service. The club will open 30 minutes before other stadium gates open. In another story you'll find at thecentersquare.com, the 2023 funding deal from Louisiana state lawmakers, which included a lease renewal through 2050, included $366 million in state tax money, along with $135 million for taxpayers in Milwaukee and the county over 27-year renewal. In Louisiana, the Center Square editor Misty Castile reports as of May, more than 200,000 Louisianans had left the state's Medicaid rolls over the previous year, while participation in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, declined by about 168,000 people as of April. Federal policy changes also taking effect last summer, leading to some of those declines. Now, the enrollment declines come as state lawmakers approved several measures during the 2026 legislative session aimed at increasing oversight, verification, and coordination within public assistance programs. Supporters say the changes improving program integrity and helping ensure benefits only go to eligible recipients. But critics in Louisiana say the new requirements could create additional hurdles for families seeking assistance. Now, one of the most closely watched measures was Senate Bill 194, which established new eligibility verification requirements for applicants seeking Medicaid and food assistance benefits. Lawmakers amended the legislation to preserve Medicaid and Children's Health Insurance Program coverage for certain lawfully residing immigrant children. Consumer Energy is seeking another major electric rate increase, a proposal that Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel says she will challenge before state regulators. The Center Square reporter Elise Apel reports the company filed the requests last week with the Michigan Public Service Commission. It's seeking to raise electric rates by approximately $456 million annually. The proposal also includes a 12-month surcharge of $25 million, an additional $52 million over 3 years for storm restoration expenses, and an expansion of a cost recovery mechanism approved in its previous rate case. Now, in March, regulators authorized the utility to collect an additional $276.6 million in revenue. As previously reported by the Center Square, that increase translated to a nearly 9% rise in residential electric rates, which just hit ratepayers' bill in May. Nessel said her office will formally intervene in that case, as it routinely does in utility rate proceedings. And North Carolina continues in their counties facing a recurring pattern of higher than expected healthcare costs for inmates, according to a new report. The report comes out of UNC Chapel Hill and was commissioned by the North Carolina Association of County Commissioners. The Center Square contributor David Beasley reports small to mid-sized counties face extreme triple-digit percentage volatility in inmate healthcare costs, while large urban counties have smaller percentage variations that still translate into massive cash deficits due to the sheer volume. Now, county budgets face unprecedented strain from an aging inmate population, volatile healthcare inflation, and complex behavioral health needs, the report found. Unexpected medical needs were the key driver of those cost overruns, with the taxpayers footing the bill. An aging inmate population is another factor in the rising healthcare costs. Yet another is the fact that inmates often have limited access to health care before they were imprisoned. Federal funding for inmate care is limited by state and other laws, but leaving local governments, they're the ones that are footing the bill, and their taxpayers are paying the price. And that's just some of what America is talking about. Again, get those headlines in the description below or at thecentersquare.com. From my studios in Central Illinois, I'm Greg Bishop, and you can join us back here Wednesday for more stories impacting you, the taxpayer, from around the country, only with the Center Square Daily.